book about a student from a developing country who had studied in a communist country, quote, was developed by, in brackets, two areas divisions of the CIA, in brackets, and produced by the Domestic Operations Division, and has had a high impact in the U.S. as well as the, in brackets, foreign area, in brackets, market, end quote. The book was published by the European outlet of a U.S. publishing house, was published in condensed form in two major U.S. magazines. Eric Sevareid, the CBS political commentator, in reviewing this book, spoke a larger truth than he knew when he suggested that, quote, our propaganda services could do worse than to flood, brackets, foreign, and brackets, university towns with this volume, end quote. 3. Another CIA book, the Penkovsky Papers, was published in the United States in 1965, quote, for operational reasons, end quote, but actually became commercially viable. The book was prepared and written by Whiting Agency assets who drew on actual case materials. Publication rights to the manuscript were sold to a publisher through a trust fund, which was established for the purpose. The publisher was unaware of any U.S. government interest. The publishing program in the period before the National Student Association disclosures was large in volume and varied in taste. In 1967 alone, the CIA published or subsidized well over 200 books, ranging from books on wildlife and safaris to translations of Machiavelli's A Prince into Swahili, and works of T.S. Eliot into Russian, to a parody of the famous Little Red Book of quotations from Mao entitled Quotations from Chairman Liu. The publicity in which 1967 surrounded several CIA-sponsored organizations and threatened to expose others caused the CIA to act quickly to limit its use of U.S. publishers. In direct response to the Katzenbach report, Deputy Director for Plans Desmond Fitzgerald ordered, quote, we will under no circumstances publish books, magazines, or newspapers in the United States, end quote. With this order, the CIA suspended direct publication and subsidization within the United States, not only of books, but also of journals and newsletters, including a magazine published by a United States-based proprietary for cultural and artistic exchange, a newsletter mailed to foreign students studying in North American universities under the sponsorship of a CIA proprietary foundation, and a publication on Latin American affairs published in the United States. Thus, since 1967, CIA's publishing activities have almost entirely been confined to books and other materials published abroad. During the past few years, some 250 books have been published abroad, most of them in foreign languages. As previously noted, the CIA has denied to the committee a number of titles and names of authors of the propaganda books published since 1967. Brief descriptions provided by the agency indicate the breadth of the subject matter, which includes the following topics, among many others. 1. Commercial ventures and commercial law in South Vietnam. 2. Indochina representation at the UN. 3. A memoir of the Korean War. End of page 197, beginning page 198. 4. The prospects for European Union. 5. Chile under Allende. 2. Covert use of U.S. journalists and media institutions. On February 11, 1976, the CIA announced new guidelines governing its relationship with U.S. media organizations. Effective immediately, CIA will not enter into any paid or contractual relationship with any full-time or part-time news correspondent accredited by any U.S. news service, newspaper, periodical, radio, or television network or station. Footnote 16. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 16. According to the CIA, quote, accredited and quote, applies to individuals who are, quote, formally authorized by contract or issuance of press credentials to represent themselves as correspondents, end quote. Resuming the reading. Of the approximately 50 U.S. journalists or personnel of U.S. media organizations who were employed by the CIA or maintained some other covert relationship with the CIA at the time of the announcement, fewer than one-half will be terminated under the new CIA guidelines. About half of the some 50 CIA relationships with the U.S. media were paid relationships, ranging from salaried operatives working under journalistic cover to U.S. journalists serving as, quote, independent contractors, end quote, for the CIA and being paid regularly for their services to those who receive only occasional gifts and reimbursements from the CIA. Footnote 17. Reading footnote 17. Drawn from, quote, operational case studies, end quote, provided to the committee December 16, 75 and October 21st, 75. Resuming the reading. More than a dozen United States news organizations and commercial publishing houses formally provided cover for CIA agents abroad. A few of these organizations were unaware that they provided this cover. Footnote 18. Reading footnote 18. For explanation of footnotes, see page 179. Resuming the reading. Although the variety of CIA relationships with the U.S. media makes a systematic breakdown of them almost impossible, former CIA Director Colby has distinguished among 4 types of relationships. Footnote 19. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 19. On November 30, 1973, the Washington Star-News reported that Director Colby had ordered a review of CIA media relationships in September of that year, and reported that Colby would phase out the first category but maintain journalists in each of the other 3 categories. In his testimony to the House Select Committee on Intelligence on November 6, 1975, Colby made a general reference to these categories. Resuming the reading. So, I will reread the sentence again. Although the variety of the CIA relationships with the U.S. media makes a systematic breakdown of them almost impossible, former CIA Director Colby has distinguished among 4 types of relationships. These are 1. Staff of general circulation, U.S. news organizations. 2. Staff of small or limited circulation, U.S. publications. 3. Freelance, stringers, propaganda writers, and employees of U.S. publishing houses. 4. Journalists with whom CIA maintains unpaid occasional covert contact. While the CIA did not provide the names of its media agents or the names of the media organizations with which they are connected, the committee reviewed summaries of their relationships and work with the CIA. Through this review, the committee found that, as of February 1976, 1. The first category, which would include any staff member of a general circulation U.S. news organization who functions as a paid undercover contact of the CIA, appears to be virtually phased out. The end of page 198, beginning page 199. Committee has found only 2 current relationships that fit this category, both of which are being terminated under the CIA's February 11, 1976 stated policy. The committee has also found a small number of past relationships that fit this category. In some cases, the cover arrangement consisted of reimbursing the U.S. newspaper for any articles by the CIA agent which the paper used. In at least one case, the journalistic functions assumed by a CIA staff officer for cover purposes grew to a point where the officer concluded that he could not satisfactorily serve the requirements of both his unwitting U.S. media employers and the CIA, and therefore resigned from the CIA. He maintained contact, however, with the CIA and continued, very occasionally, to report to the CIA from the countries in which he worked. 2. Of the less than 10 relationships with writers for small or limited circulation, U.S. publications such as trade journals or newsletters most are for cover purposes. 3. The third and largest category of CIA relationships with the U.S. media includes freelance journalists, quote, stringers, end quote, for newspapers, news magazines, and news services, itinerant authors, propaganda writers, and agents working undercover as employees of U.S. publishing houses abroad. With the exception of the last group, the majority of the individuals in this category are bona fide writers or journalists or photographers. Most are paid by the CIA, and virtually all are witting. Few, however, of the news organizations to which they contribute are aware of their CIA relationships. 4. The fourth category of covert relationships resembles the kind of contact that journalists have with any other department of the U.S. government in the routine performance of their journalistic duties. No money changes hands. No money changes hands. The relationships are usually limited to occasional lunches, interviews, or telephone conversations, during which information would be exchanged or verified. The difference, of course, is that the relationships are covert. The journalist either volunteers or is requested by the CIA to provide some sort of information about people with whom he is in contact. In several cases, the relationship began when the journalist approached a U.S. Embassy officer to report that he was approached by a foreign intelligence officer. In others, the CIA initiated the relationship. The first major step to impose restrictions on the use of U.S. journalists was taken by former Director Colby in the fall of 1973. According to Mr. Colby's letter to the committee, A. CIA will undertake no activity in which there is a risk of influencing domestic public opinion, either directly or indirectly. The agency will continue its prohibition against placement of material in the American media. In certain instances, usually where the initiative is on the part of the media, CIA will occasionally provide factual, non-attributable briefings to various elements of the media, but only in cases where we are sure that the senior editorial staff is aware of the source of the information provided. And then there's footnote 21, which says, Letter from William Colby to Select Committee, October 21st, 75. End of page 199, beginning page 200. B. As a general policy, the agency will not make any clandestine use of staff employees of U.S. publications which have a substantial impact or influence on public opinion. This limitation includes cover use and any other activities which might be directed by the CIA. C. A thorough review should be made of CIA use of non-staff journalists, i.e. stringers and freelancers, and also those individuals involved in journalistic activities who are in non-sensitive journalist-related positions, primarily for cover backstopping. Our goal in this exercise is to reduce such usage to a minimum. Mr. Colby's letter specified that operational use of staff, that is, full-time correspondents and other employees of major U.S. news, magazines, newspapers, wire services, or television networks, was to be avoided. Use would be less restricted for, quote, stringers, end quote, or occasional correspondents for these news organizations, as well as for correspondents working for smaller technical or specialized publications. The public statement that the CIA issued on February 11, 1976, expressed a policy of even greater restraint. Effective immediately, CIA will not enter into any paid or contractual relationship with any full-time or part-time news correspondent accredited by any U.S. news service, newspaper, periodical, radio, or television network or station. As soon as feasible, the agency will bring existing relationships with individuals in these groups into conformity with this new policy. CIA recognizes that members of these groups, U.S. media and religious personnel, may wish to provide information to the CIA on matters of foreign intelligence of interest to the U.S. government. The CIA will continue to welcome information volunteered by such individuals. Footnote 22. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 22. CIA instructions interpreting the new policy explain that, quote, the term contractual applies to any written or oral agreement obligating the agency to provide financial remuneration, including regular salaries, spot payments, or reimbursement of out-of-pocket operational expenses, or the provision of other material benefits that are clearly intended as a reward for services rendered the agency, end quote. Resuming the reading. From CIA testimony later that month, the committee learned that this prohibition extends to non-Americans accredited to U.S. media organizations. Nevertheless, this prohibition does not cover, quote, unaccredited, end quote, Americans serving in U.S. media organizations, or freelance writers. As previously noted, the CIA has informed the committee that of the approximately 50 CIA relationships with U.S. journalists or employees of U.S. media organizations, fewer than one half will be terminated under the new guidelines. Footnote 23. Pausing the reading, reading footnote 23. CIA response of March 17, 1976. Number 76-0315/1. 3. Two issues, quote, fallout, end quote, and the integrity of a free press. In examining the CIA's past and present use of the U.S. media, the committee finds two reasons for concern. The first is the potential inherent in covert media operations for manipulating or incidentally, end of page 200, beginning page 201, misleading the American public. The second is the damage to the credibility and independence of a free press, which may be caused by covert relationships with U.S. journalists and media organizations. In his 1967 order prohibiting CIA publication in this country, then Deputy Director for Plans Desmond Fitzgerald raised the first issue. He stated, fallout in the United States from a foreign publication which we support is inevitable and consequently permissible. In extensive testimony, CIA employees, both past and present, have conceded that there is no way to shield the American public from such, quote, fallout, end quote. As a former senior official of the agency put it in their testimony, there is no way in this increasingly small world of ours, of insulating information that one puts out overseas and confining it to the area where one puts it out. When British intelligence was operating in the last century, they could plant an outrageous story in some local publication and feel fairly confident that no one else would ever hear about it. That would be the end of it. That is no longer the case. Whether or not this type of overseas activity should be allowed to continue is subject to differing views and judgments. My own would be that we would be fools to relinquish it because it serves a very useful purpose. Footnote 25. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 25. Thomas H. Karamessine's testimony of a former deputy director for plans. October 22nd, 75, page 46. Resuming the reading. The same former CIA official continued, if you plant an article in some paper overseas, and it is a hard-hitting article or a revelation, there is no way of guaranteeing that it is not going to be picked up and published by the Associated Press in this country. Footnote 25a. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 25a. Former Deputy Director for Plans testimony. October 28th, 75, page 36. Resuming the reading. The domestic fallout of covert propaganda comes from many sources. Books intended primarily for an English-speaking foreign audience, press placements that are picked up by international wire services, press services controlled by the CIA, and direct funding of foreign institutions that attempt to propagandize the United States public and Congress. In the case of books, substantial fallout in the U.S. may be a necessary part of the propaganda process. For example, CIA records for 1967 state that certain books about China subsidized or even produced by the agency, quote, circulate principally in the U.S. as a prelude to later distribution abroad, end quote. Several of these books on China were widely reviewed in the United States, often in juxtaposition to the sympathetic view of the emerging China as presented by Edgar Snow. At least once, a book review for an agency book, which appeared in the New York Times, was written by a CIA writer under contract. E. Edward Hunt, who had been in charge of contacts with U.S. publishers in the late 1960s, acknowledged in testimony before this committee that CIA books circulated in the U.S. and suggested that such fallout may not have been unintentional. End of page 201. Beginning page 202. Question. But with anything that was published in English, the United States citizenry would become a likely audience for publication? Never mind. Mr. Hunt. A likely audience, definitely. Question. Did you take some sort of steps to make sure that things that were published in English were kept out of or away from the American reading public? Mr. Hunt. It was impossible because Prager was a commercial U.S. publisher. His books had to be seen, had to be reviewed, had to be brought here, had to be read. Hunt. If your targets are foreign, then where are they? They don't all necessarily read English, and we had a bilateral agreement with the British that we wouldn't propagandize their people. So unless the book goes into a lot of languages or is published in India, for example, where English is a lingua franca, then you have some basic problems. And I think the way this was rationalized by the Project Review Board was that the ultimate target was foreign, which was true, but how much of the Prager output actually got abroad for any impact, I think is highly arguable. Footnote 26. Pausing the reading footnote 26. E. Howard Hunt testimony, January 10, 76, page 73 and 74. Resuming the reading. An American who reads one of these books, which purportedly is authored by a Chinese defector, would not know that his thoughts and opinions about China are possibly being shaped by an agency of the United States government. Given the paucity of information and the inaccessibility of China in the 1960s, the CIA may have helped and shaped American attitudes toward the emerging China. The CIA considered such, quote, fallout, end quote, inevitable. Another example of the dangers of, quote, fallout, end quote, involved two proprietary news services that the CIA maintained in Europe. Inevitably, these news services had U.S. subscribers. The larger of the two was subscribed to by over 30 U.S. newspapers. In an effort to reduce the problem of fallout, the CIA made a senior official at the major U.S. dailies aware that the CIA controlled these two press services. A serious problem arises from the possible use of U.S. publications for press placements. Materials furnished to the committee describe a relationship which poses this problem. It began in August 1967 after the Katzenbach Committee's recommendations and continued until May 1974. In this case, a U.S.-based executive of a major U.S. newspaper was contacted by the CIA, quote, on a confidential basis, in view of his access to information of intelligence and operational interests, end quote. The news executive served as a witting unpaid collaborator for intelligence collection and received briefings from the CIA which, quote, were of professional benefit, end quote, to him. The CIA materials state that it was visualized that propaganda, if agreeable to him, might be initially inserted in his paper and then be available for reprinting by Latin American news outlets. There is no indication in the file that the subject agreed or that he did place propaganda in his newspaper. Footnote 27. Reading footnote 27. CIA Operational Case Study number 14. End of page 202, beginning page 203. The danger of CIA propaganda contaminating U.S. media, quote, fall out, end quote, occurs in virtually any instance of propaganda use. The possibility is quite real, even when the CIA does not use any U.S. journalist or publication in carrying out the propaganda project. Where a CIA propaganda campaign causes stories to appear in many prestigious news outlets around the world, as occurred at a time of the Chilean elections in 1970, it is truly impossible to insulate the United States from propaganda fallout. Indeed, CIA records for the September-October 1970 propaganda effort in Chile indicate that, quote, replay, end quote, of propaganda in the U.S. was not unexpected. A cable summary for September 25th, 1970 reports, Sao Paulo, Tegucigalpa, Buenos Aires, Lima, Montevideo, Bogota, Mexico City, report continued replay of Chile-themed materials. Items also carried in New York Times, Washington Post. Propaganda activities continue to generate good coverage of Chile developments along our theme guidance. Footnote 28. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 28. Chile Task Force Log. R597. Resuming the reading. The fallout problem is probably the most serious when the U.S. public is dependent on the, quote, polluted, end quote, media channel for its information on a particular subject. When the news events have occurred in relatively isolated parts of the world, few major news organizations may have been able to cover them initially, and worldwide coverage reflects whatever propaganda predominates in the media of the area. Another situation in which effects of, quote, fallout, end quote, in the United States may be significant is that in which specialized audiences in the United States, area study specialists, for example, may unknowingly rely heavily on materials produced by or subsidized by the CIA. The danger of this form of dependence is less now than it had been prior to the freer flow of Western travelers to the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and China. In its inquiry into the activities of a Vietnamese institution, the committee discovered a particularly unfortunate example of domestic fallout of covert propaganda activities. The institution was a CIA-inspired creation. The intention of the CIA, according to its own records, was not to undertake propaganda against the United States. Whatever the design, the propaganda effort had an impact on the American public and congressional opinion. The CIA provided $170,000 per year in 1974 and 1975 for the support of this institution's publications. The embassy in the United States distributed the magazine to American readers, including the offices of all United States congressmen and senators. The institution, on at least one occasion, invited a group of American congressmen to Vietnam and sponsored their activities on at least part of their trip. Through this institution, the CIA, however, inadvertently engaged in propagandizing the American public, including its Congress, on the controversial issue of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. One particular kind of possible, quote, fallout, end quote, has aroused official concern. That is, fallout upon the U.S. government of the CIA's, quote, black propaganda, end quote. Propaganda that appears to originate from an unfriendly source. Because the source of black propaganda is so fully concealed, the CIA recognizes that it risks seriously misleading U.S. policy. End of page 203, beginning page 204. Makers. An agency regulation specifies that the Directorate of Operations should notify appropriate elements of the DDI and the intelligence community if the results of a black operation might influence the thinking of senior U.S. officials or affect U.S. intelligence estimates. Regular coordination between the CIA and State Department's INR have been instituted to prevent the self-deception of, quote, senior U.S. officials, end quote, through black propaganda. It should be noted that this procedure applies only to black propaganda and only to, quote, senior U.S. officials, end quote. No mechanism exists to protect the U.S. public and Congress from fallout from black propaganda or any other propaganda. The committee recognizes that other countries make extensive use of the international media for their propaganda purposes. The United States public is not insulated from this propaganda either. It is clear, however, that the strongest defense a free country has from propaganda of any kind is a free and vigorous press that expresses diverse points of view. Similarly, the most effective way for this country to respond to the use of propaganda abroad is to permit American journalists and news organizations to pursue their work without jeopardizing their credibility in the eyes of the world through covert use of them. Section C. Covert use of U.S. religious groups. The committee considers religious groups, like academia and the press, to be among the most important of our society's institutions. As such, Any covert relationship that might either influence them or jeopardize their reputation is extremely sensitive. Moreover, operational use of U.S. religious organizations differs from the use of other elements of U.S. society. It is a special case in that virtually all religions are inherently supranational. Making operational use of U.S. religious groups for national purposes both violates their nature and undermines their bonds with kindred groups around the world. In its examination of CIA relationships with domestic institutions, the committee has focused exclusively on the use of U.S. religious organizations. 1. Restrictions on use of religious personnel. The CIA guidelines issued in the wake of the Katzenbach Committee report required prior approval by the DDO for operational use of any employee, staff member, or official of a U.S. educational or private organization. This restriction applied to the use of these individuals who were affiliated with American religious organizations. The CIA has provided the committee with no other regulations that apply specifically to the use of religious groups. In a letter to this committee, however, Mr. Colby stated that the CIA used religious groups with great caution and that their use required special approval within the agency. Deputy Director for Operations regulations require the Deputy Director for Operations approval for the use of religious groups. He has the responsibility of ensuring that such operational use avoids infringement or damage to the individual religious personnel involved in their group. Such, end of page 204, beginning page 205. Use is carefully weighed and approvals in recent years have been relatively few in number. Footnote 29. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 29. Letter from William Colby to the Select Committee, October 21st, 75. Resuming the reading. On February 11, 1976, the CIA announced, CIA has no secret paid or contractual relationship with any American clergyman or missionary. This practice will be continued as a matter of policy. The CIA has assured the committee that the prohibition against, quote, all paid or contractual relationships, end quote, is in fact a prohibition against any operational use of Americans following a religious vocation. 2. Scope of relationships. The number of American clergy or missionaries used by the CIA has been small. The CIA has informed the committee of a total of 14 covert arrangements, which involved direct operational use of 21 individuals. Only 4 of these relationships were current in August 1975, and according to the CIA, they were used only for intelligence collection, or in one case, for a minor role in preserving the cover of another asset. The other 10 relationships with U.S. religious personnel had been terminated before August 1975. 4 of them ended within the last 5 years. In 6 or 7 cases, the CIA paid salaries, bonuses, or expenses to the religious personnel, or helped to fund projects run by them. Most of the individuals were used for covert action purposes. Several were involved in large covert action projects of the mid-60s, which were directed at, quote, competing, end quote, with communism in the Third World. 3. Issues, quote, fallout, end quote, violation of trust. As several of the relationships, all terminated, involved the religious personnel in media activity, some of the same concerns must be voiced as when U.S. journalists are used covertly. The danger of U.S., quote, fallout, end quote, of CIA propaganda existed in 3 or 4 of the relationships with U.S. religious personnel. The more serious issue, however, is the question of the confidentiality of the relationships among members of the clergy and their congregations. Of the recent relationships, the most damaging would appear to be that of a U.S. priest serving the CIA as an informant on student and religious dissidents. Of the earlier cases, one exemplifies the extent to which the CIA used confidential pastoral relationships. The CIA used the pastor of a church in a third world country as a, quote, principal agent, end quote, to carry out covert action projects, and as a spotter, assessor, asset developer, and recruiter. He collected information on political developments and on personalities. He passed CIA propaganda to the local press. According to the CIA's description of the case, the pastor's analysis were based on his long-term friendships with the personalities, and the agents under him were, quote, well known to him in his professional life, end quote. At first, the CIA provided only occasional gifts to the pastor in return. End of page 205, beginning page 206, for his services. Later, for over 10 years, the CIA paid him a salary that reached $11,414 annually. Four, the CIA aid U.S. religious organizations and personnel. Conclusions and recommendations. The committee welcomes the policy announced by the CIA on February 11, 1976, that prohibits any operational use of Americans following a religious vocation. The fact that relatively few American clergy or missionaries have been used by the CIA suggests that neither this country's capacity to collect intelligence nor its covert action capability would be seriously affected by a total ban on their operational use. Therefore, the committee recommends that the CIA's recent prohibition on covert, paid, or contractual relationships between the Central Intelligence Agency and any American clergyman or missionary should be established by law. End of page 206, beginning page 207. And I will stop here for this recording.